Hey there, it's the Comics Kid 2099, and I am back for another review. This time for an animated movie called Akira. Or, if you've never seen this movie before, you may have heard it pronounced as Akira, as I did before I saw the film. This is a 1988 anime movie based on a 1982 manga series of the same name. Unfortunately, I didn't write down the name of the man who created this series, but I'm very certain that he's the same man who also was behind this movie. So, unfortunately, I don't have that name written down, and it's a name that I would have trouble pronouncing anyway, so sorry. The world of Akira is very interesting. It's a world where I would love to see many more stories. You can tell there's a whole lot of urban degradation going on. There's also a little bit of science fiction-y elements going on, and I always love the science fiction stuff. And even though there's a whole lot of fantastical, very unrealistic elements in this movie, it feels believable. And that's really what any movie should strive for, or any story for that matter. If you have unrealistic elements like time travel, unicorns, cloning, things like that, then basically your goal is to make me believe that those things can exist in your story. And if you can't do that, then you've got a problem. And Akira does actually make me believe that these things are happening in the movie. There's a lot of potential in the first half of this movie. Right in the opening scene, we get to see that there's political unrest with some kind of group of terrorists who are trying to take down the government. And then we also get to see biker gangs who are having very gruesome, very violent wars in the streets with each other. And then we get to see that there's some kind of genetic engineering project going on with the military. In the first half of this movie, all of these elements are introduced right around the exact same time, and I was very fearful that all of these elements weren't going to work well together. And for the most part, they come together pretty well for one single story, at least until near the end of the movie. Unfortunately, it is still too many elements for a 2-hour movie. What we have here, we have ideas that the government may or may not be corrupt. We have this genetic engineering project led by a colonel who we are told is a good guy, but I just can't see it because basically he's experimenting on little children without their consent. And we also have these biker gangs and one particular character, Kaneda, who I am supposed to feel sorry for, I guess. And then we also have this terrorist group. And unfortunately, I know nothing about these terrorists other than they kill people and they want to take down the government. But we don't know what their own goals are after taking down the government. Usually when you have some kind of political movement like this in a story, it's good to give them some kind of ideology so that we can understand what they stand for. And here, we really don't know what these terrorists stand for at all. It's understandable that there's so many elements in this movie when you look at the manga. There are 6 volumes, each measuring at about 300 pages, and the manga series wasn't even finished until 1990, 2 years after this movie was done. A lot of this feels like it doesn't really belong in a 2-hour movie, and I absolutely feel like this doesn't belong in a 2-hour movie. I think this would have worked a whole lot better if this was a 4-hour miniseries or something like that. I'm not sure if that kind of format was very popular in 1988, especially with anime movies, but nonetheless, 2 hours is just not enough time to explore what basically ends up being a couple thousand pages from the manga. As I mentioned, there's a sect of the government of New Tokyo that has these 3 children and they're experimenting on them. And then, for some reason, they kidnap this kid who is comatose in the middle of the street and they start experimenting on him also. We really don't see any reason why they're doing this, and I'm assuming that the reason is actually given in the manga series. But unfortunately, that's not my problem. I shouldn't have to read all 6 300-page volumes of this series in order to understand what's happening in this 2-hour movie. We don't understand why they're experimenting on these children. If I had to make any assumptions, which I shouldn't have to do, and if I am having to make assumptions, that means that the film needs to fill in a few gaps for me, then I would assume that the corrupt members of government that we have are apparently trying to use these superpowered children to maybe secure their power hold. But then, why give it to this colonel who's very clearly opposed to your corruptness? And yeah, to be fair, they do try to arrest the colonel, but it seems pretty clear to me very early on that the colonel doesn't really seem like the kind of guy that you would ever put in charge of this kind of project. And let's talk about the colonel for a minute, shall we? He always goes on about how the bureaucrats are all corrupt and they're fat and they're capitalist and all that, and that he's going to send people to go and arrest them, and if they resist, then they're going to be shot. And I don't really understand where he's coming from. Let me make this clear. This man who experiments on children is talking about how his bosses are corrupt. Where does he get off calling them corrupt? He should be put in a padded cell with no food and water for the rest of his life. Let me make this very clear. He's experimenting on children. We get a very vague flashback at the end of this movie about where these couple of kids came from, but really I just don't see where the impetus comes from. Oh, these kids have slight ESP powers. Let's amplify these powers and turn them into shriveled up prunes. Several times, we're even acting like this guy is the good guy. He comes up to Tetsuo, don't worry, I'll get to him in a minute, and he says, hey, you have to come back so that we can give you the medicine. And Tetsuo, rightly so, says, no. This whole branch of the New Tokyo government that's experimenting on children and giving them superpowers, it all becomes even more flummoxing when you realize that apparently there's a slight possibility that one of the projects that these people worked on, named Akira, was apparently responsible for World War III some 40 years earlier. Actually, that timeline doesn't quite line up, does it? I mean, we see at the beginning of the movie, in the year 1988, an atomic bomb goes off. And then we see this movie is set in the year 2019. Yet, these are children who aren't 50 years old, so it doesn't really make sense. Anyway, the Colonel says that apparently there is a rumor that this Akira kid is the one who caused World War III. So let me get this straight. There is even a tiny possibility that this superpowered child who was created by the government is responsible for causing a world war. And for some reason, the government still thinks it's a good idea to create more children like this? I get that the comics that this movie was based on weren't yet finished when this movie was being made, so in theory, the people behind this kind of had to fill in a few spots that probably weren't filled in yet in the comics at this point. However, it should have been clear to anyone involved in this movie that this is a very huge plot hole. I can see absolutely no reason that the government of New Tokyo would even be creating one child with superpowers, let alone 4. I can see a reason why the people behind this movie would put this into the movie. After all, they need some sort of plot device so that Tetsuo has superpowers. But it just doesn't make sense from a character standpoint. Why do the characters do things? If the answer to that question is, well, the movie's plot needs it to happen, then you need to go back to square one and start rewriting the script. So let's talk about Tetsuo for a minute, shall we? He's part of this biker gang who's going around chopping people's heads off with a pipe wrench or whatever, and then he accidentally runs into this kid who apparently escaped from this ESP kindergarten project thing that New Tokyo has been setting up. And then I guess the government comes and they kidnap Tetsuo for no real reason at all. And then the doctor just starts experimenting on him. Really, there's no explanation for why this is going on. And then every time Tetsuo has like a bad dream or escapes his cell or whatever, the people around him are always like, how dare you escape? How dare you? They're acting all holier than thou when, to be honest, he should be the one saying, how dare you, sir? Unfortunately, we don't really know anything at all about Tetsuo. It's not until over halfway into the movie that two characters offhandedly mention that when he was a child, people used to pick on him. And apparently that's reason enough for him to become a psycho who kills people at the drop of a hat. So we're told that he has a bad childhood, and I guess we're meant to assume that that's the reason why he's going around killing people and he's misusing his powers. However, later in the movie, he's turning into this giant blob monster, and he's talking to his childhood friend, and he's saying, you have to stop me. My body's not doing what I told it to do. I'm going to accidentally kill my girlfriend over here. So, is he or is he not crazy? If he is crazy, we need a better reason why he's crazy earlier in the movie. It can't just be casually dropped in halfway into the movie so that we can kind of sort of understand why he's killing people like he's nuts or something. And if he's not crazy, then why should I care about anything that's happened in this movie? I have to assume, if he's not really crazy, that every time he kills someone or every time he escapes and his powers start exploding around him like he's a Dragon Ball Z character, that's not really Tetsuo. That's really just the corrupt power inside him who's voicing itself through Tetsuo's body. And if that's the case, it's just some artificial construct that doesn't really have a personality at all. It's just corruptness incarnate. And I don't really care about that. What we really needed here is a character who we can visibly see going down this very disturbed path, and then he gets these superpowers, and then we can see, okay, this is why he's killing people, because he's disturbed, and he's always been disturbed. It's very messily handled either way you want to take this, whether Tetsuo is crazy or whether he's not. At one point, about halfway into the movie, the bosses of this colonel guy, the ones who are apparently corrupt, they tell him that apparently there's a religious movement who is expecting Lord Akira to return and save them like some kind of messiah. Okay, Akira was an actual project that New Tokyo worked on some years ago. So this makes me wonder, who leaked the reports that there was a kid named Akira with superpowers? It's never really explained, and I guess I can make some educated guesses, but I really shouldn't have to, especially when there are so many areas where I have to make guesses in this kind of movie. At the beginning of the movie, we see one kid with ESP powers who's being dragged along by this other guy, and then the government is chasing him because he kidnapped their property or whatever. And this is really the one thing that needs to happen so that the rest of the movie can happen. Tetsuo's on his motorcycle after he just decapitated a dude, and then he runs into the kid who's just standing in the middle of the road because he's an idiot. And then Tetsuo's almost in a coma and the government has to kidnap him, and then the rest of the plot can happen. My question to you is, who is the dude who is rescuing the kid with ESP powers? We see that the kid with the ESP powers, he really wasn't trying to escape. He was pretty happy with his friends back at the project or whatever. My first guess is that this is one of the terrorists who's part of the larger group that we later see in the movie. However, I don't really understand any reason why the terrorists would be rescuing these kids, especially when, for the rest of the movie, the terrorists are acting like they're not even aware that these kids have superpowers and are being held captive by the government. This is another element that I'm pretty sure is explained pretty much a whole lot better in the comic books, but once again, I can't go to the comic books to fill in this gap in the story because all I have for this story is the movie itself. The Colonel talks about how corrupt his bosses are, and I'm wondering, is he just talking out his butt, or are his bosses actually corrupt? We see one guy who kind of looks like a mouse, and apparently he is somehow giving leaks of information to the terrorists for a reason that I can't discern. There is no reason why this higher up in the government should be giving information to the terrorists who are trying to tear down his government. If they succeed, then he doesn't have a job. And if they fail, then why is he doing this? Once again, we don't have any character motivations here because this dude barely even shows up in the first hour and a half of this movie, and in the last half hour of this movie, we're not given any reason why he's been doing what he's doing. Once again, this is just not really handled very well, and I'm not sure if it's because none of this really came out in the comics until after this movie came out, or if this is just an original creation of this movie. I'm not really certain. But this is the only guy in government who we see that's actually corrupt, unless you count the colonel who experiments on children and thinks there's nothing wrong with that. Is the government actually corrupt, or is it one dude who's corrupt? Once again, we're just kind of left to answer that question ourselves. One thing I'm always looking for in a movie is the character arc, usually for the protagonist, but if it's a really well done movie, you'll have more than one character go through some kind of arc. In this movie, I really can't see any characters going through any kind of arc at all, sadly. I've already talked about Tetsuo, how we're not even sure if he is himself for most of this movie, and if he is, well, I'm not even sure what kind of arc you could say he goes through. He's kind of sort of normal in that he decapitates gang members' heads on a motorcycle, then he goes really, really crazy and he kills his friends and other people who he doesn't know, then he kind of goes back to not being crazy, and then he just sort of disappears into thin air. That's not really a character arc, since we don't get to see anything that takes him along this journey. Why is he crazy? Well, kids picked on him. Oh, boo frickin' who? Everyone gets picked on when they're a kid. So then, why does he go back to being less crazy? Again, we're not really sure. And this isn't even accounting for the fact that it may not even be Tetsuo speaking for about half of this movie. I'm relatively certain it's not supposed to be Tetsuo, since later he's kind of redeemed himself in the sense that everyone just forgives him for all the hundreds of people he's probably killed. And then you have Kaneda, who's kind of sort of the official leader of this gang, and I don't really see him going through any kind of character arc either. At the beginning of the movie, he's kind of a jerk. He beats people for, I don't really know why. He's part of a gang, and that's what gang members do. And then, after his friend gets kidnapped, he starts screaming and pitching a crybaby fit. We see sometimes that he's kind of goofy, like whenever he's captured by the police, he acts like an idiot. And then he sees this terrorist girl who's trying to blow up the government, and for no explicable reason at all, he's fallen head over heels in love with her. He's following her around everywhere. He almost gets himself killed at least twice. And then when she kills a dude, he acts like she just swatted a fly or something. At one point, he's yelling at the ESP kids that Tetsuo is his friend, so it should be his responsibility to kill him. And that's the first little hint that we might be getting some kind of character arc from him, except that I don't really get the sensation that this guy is the kind of person who thinks that this whole thing is his responsibility. Why does he think that Tetsuo being his friend makes him responsible for cleaning up this mess? Especially if he doesn't have the capability of cleaning up this mess. Tetsuo is very clearly a god inside a child's flesh. In theory, Kaneda should know that these ESP kids also have powers, and maybe it's their responsibility to clean up this mess. Or, if we're talking about responsibility, maybe the people who created this monster should be doing something about it. Instead, they're just kind of going around killing all the people who are in government because apparently they're corrupt, and we have to take their word for it. The only other character who I can see as maybe having a character arc is the character called Kei or Kai. She doesn't really give so much as 2 glances at Kaneda throughout this entire movie, even though they're paired together through about half of it when they go in to rescue Tetsuo. And then at the very end of the movie, Kaneda is sort of unconscious / dreaming off into space, and then Kei is like screaming his name like, Kaneda! So, does she like him now? Does she care about him? Does she even know his name? When did this happen? Once again, if this is a character arc, you know, her going from not really caring about this guy at all to liking him a whole lot, then we need to see why she goes through this change of character. And sadly, I really don't see it. Kaneda doesn't really act any different at the end of this movie than he does at the beginning, and she certainly does, but I'm not really sure why she does. You might be thinking that I really hated this movie, and that's absolutely not the case. I really enjoyed watching it. There's a whole lot of really well done animation. The character voice work is very well done. That is, if you're watching the one with the English dubs. That's what I watched. And a lot of the story elements are really good ideas, and they've even been picked and plundered for later series and stories. Batman Beyond owes about 95% of its existence to this movie, and the movie that recently came out, Chronicle, is also kinda sorta like this, minus about 100% of the stuff that's happening in this movie. I can definitely say that Akira is very culturally significant, and I certainly like a lot of the ideas here, but unfortunately this movie doesn't really execute them very well. If you haven't seen it, I would definitely recommend watching this movie, but don't go in expecting this to be the greatest anime film that you've ever seen in your life. I'm sure there are certainly better ones out there. And so, having said all that, I don't believe I mispronounced any names in this video, so I'm the Comics Kid 2099. I'll see you next time.